Mitakuye Oyasin, welcome to All Our Relations and to the People's Spiral of U.S. History, from Daganoweda to Solartopia. Read to you by the author, me, Harvey Sluggo Wasserman. Recorded here in the Columbus Free Press Network studio in Columbus, Ohio, with Train the Priest as the engineer. The cover art on this book is a serpent that shows the cycles and the spiral of U.S. history. It ends with a snake's venomous mouth. Inside the mouth, you can read Imperial Madness, and there is a blonde wig on the head of the snake for reasons which I think you might surmise. Introduction. We were born in 1776. Our mother was indigenous, our father a Puritan. The fierce genetic contractions of our raucous double helix blasted through 6 shortening cycles, which became a spiral. The telling of this story was born in 1970, the child of a terrible war and a countercultural rebellion. Its shape was inspired by William Appleman Williams's Contours of American History. Its worldview has many roots, among them Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, published exactly 40 years ago. Today, we face corporate imperial autocracy, cultural chaos, and ecological collapse. We desperately seek a sustainable synthesis of our feminist natural core with our techno drive for dominance, an evolutionary leap without which our species won't survive. A new millennial generation and a solartopian vision give us hope, but we're running out of time and space, so let's take a good look at how we got here. The People's Spiral of U.S. History, from Daganoweda to Solartopia, by Harvey Sluggo Wasserman. First review, Collector's Edition, copyright 2019, by Farmers Green Power, LLC, all rights reserved. I can be reached at solartopia@gmail.com, solartopia.org, or by snail mail at P.O. Box 4446, Los Angeles, California, 91607. From Howard Zinn, Harvey Wasserman constantly provokes and educates us, sometimes outrages us, often inspires us. He is always delightfully readable, and, we hope, delightfully listenable. You can't put it down. It flows like a thrilling novel, the best history book I've ever read. Lila Garrett, Connect the Dots, KPFK Pacifica Radio. Genius, a magnificent piece. I'm blown away by it. Eric Roberts, actor. That's all the kudos I'll read. You can get the book if you like at solartopia.org or Amazon or other places, and read the rest of the kudos. We are going to go into the book now. It is A People's Spiral of U.S. History, from Daganoweda to Solartopia. Menu or table of contents. Conception, our indigenous DNA. Mother Earth's matriarchs nurture our nation. Our Puritan DNA, the cult of God the Father and his city on the hill. The People's Spiral of U.S. History consists of 6 cycles. The first is Infant Empire, 1688 to 1828. Then Youthful Destiny, 1828 to 1896. Bully Manhood, 1896 to 1932. Full Adulthood, 1932 to 1960. Midlife Crisis, 1960 to 1976. Imperial Senility, 1976 to 1992. Followed by Flatline, our End of Empire Zombie Coma, Clinton, Bush II, Obama. Then Trumpocalypse, our Imperial Vultures come home to roost. And finally, getting to Solartopia. We start at conception. Every culture passes through the age phases of the individual person. Each has its childhood, youth, adulthood, and old age, its determined phases which invariably occur. Oswald Spengler, Decline of the West. Our indigenous DNA, Mother Earth's matriarchs, nurture our nation in the womb of indigenous America. In the womb of indigenous America, our nation was conceived. Our mother is a tribal matriarch. Her beloved son, Daganoweda, was the true father of American democracy and of our federal union. Everything American is rooted amongst the countless diverse societies that were here so long before Columbus. Now, a revived matriarchy is poised for rebirth, and not a moment too soon. Women ran native North America. They raised the kids, chose the chiefs, shaped our indigenous DNA. Said the Hopi, quote, "The family, the dwelling house, and the field are inseparable because the woman is the heart of these, and they rest with her. Among us, the family traces its kin from the mother. Hence, all its possessions are hers. The man builds the house, but the woman is the owner because she repairs and preserves it. The man cultivates the field, but he renders its harvest into the woman's keeping because upon her it rests to prepare the food, and the surplus of stores for barter depends on her thrift." Formed as early as 1140 A.D., the matriarchal Iroquois Confederacy was the cradle of our civilization. Its laws comprise our indigenous originalism. Its spiritual founder was Daganoweda, the Haudenosaunee peacemaker. Amidst a terrible war, he found the great orator Iawentha mourning in the woods. Legend says this exalted chief was grieving his wife and 3 daughters. Their loss in battle was rare. Much indigenous warfare was mere ritual that stopped with first blood. Victorious tribes usually adopted captured women and children. Reports of indigenous rape are virtually non-existent. White prisoners often chose to, quote, "go native." But for eons, across what's now upstate New York, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca were constantly at war. These Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse, often tortured their male captives, then ate the hearts of the bravest. Their guerrilla tactics changed the world. They shot from behind trees, struck as the spirit moved them, then slipped away to regroup and return. They improvised in tune with Mother Nature. Had the indigenous been immune to the European diseases that reduced their numbers by more than 90%, the whites could never have marched across the continent as they did. Had the Europeans opened their minds to the wisdom of the indigenous cultures, this would be a far healthier planet. Had they cooperated instead of conquered, learned instead of slaughtered, we would be an infinitely greater nation. Our species would have a far better chance to survive on this planet. While Europe emerged from the Dark Ages, Daganoweda quieted the wars that plagued the 5 nations. The peacemaker was a stutterer. Iawentha spoke his heart. Together they traveled to Finger Lakes in a stone canoe and convened America's first Congress, the model for our own. The French called the Haudenosaunee Iroquois, a serpentine slur. Except as fierce warriors, they've been studiously ignored by our mainstream historians. But the Haudenosaunee formed humankind's purest democracy. While the emerging states of Europe suffered through countless tyrannies of absolute, inbred, often idiotic monarchs, the Iroquois Union was based on consensual harmony. The 5 nations sent 50 chiefs to the Central Council Daganoweda established. Representation was based on tribal head counts. The many tribes kept their traditional structures, but collaborated under the Kainarikavova, Great Law of Peace. Individual liberties were sacred, carefully spelled out in the 117 codicils that preceded our own first 10 amendments. While the men hunted, fished, and pontificated, the tribal matriarchs prepared the food, kept the fires, raised the kids. They chose the chiefs and could remove them whenever. Letting the men blab away, quote, makes them feel important, smiles one Onondaga matriarch. Quote, it gives them something to do. The whole thing, said Ben Franklin, quote, runs better than the British Parliament. Maybe 15 million indigenous inhabited North America before Columbus. Maybe 100 million peopled the Western Hemisphere. In what's now the U.S., 1,000 bands, tribes, clans, nations, confederacies spoke more than 500 languages. Sophisticated in their diversity, each had its own culture, traditions, belief systems, worldview. Extended indigenous families shared feast and famine in unison. In all of North America, only the town of Cahokia, near today's St. Louis, approached a population of as high as 60,000. The mysterious mounds that surround it speak to ancient civilizations long since vanished for reasons we may never know. Many tribal names mean, quote, the people, unquote. Until the whites came, the indigenous had no sense of a broader, unified identity. Most had legends referring to a migration from Asia. Some ancestors certainly crossed a land bridge from Siberia, but most also contend their core has always been here, that at least some of the human species originated in the Western Hemisphere. On the science of that belief, time will tell. There were chiefs and shamans, warriors and captives, but no original sin or hellish afterlife. Death is still inseparable from life. The indigenous favor burial amongst the bones of their ancestors, whose spirits they still embrace in both life and passing. Every rock, plant, river, cloud, forest, insect, animal, including the human, walks with a universal consciousness named Orenda, Wakan, Manitou, Huaca, and more. Indigenous oral histories reflect ceaseless cycles of natural seasons, reproductive rhythms, rhymes of generation, free from fear of a hateful god or terminal apocalypse. Many of the indigenous societies, like the Haudenosaunee, were essentially matriarchies, run by the women who raised the kids, sustained the houses and gardens, ran the show. A woman's right to choose was guaranteed, with roots and herbs and centuries of knowing just how to use them. Sexual diversity was often seen as just another strand in the web of life. The indigenous generally sustained a level of physical health long lost to urban Europe. Pristine lakes, streams, and ocean beaches were their everyday companions, accompanied by ritual sweat baths and the rigorous exercise of a nature-based existence. They made their clothes from what the earth provided. For the indigenous core, land was a living organism, everywhere revered, and often shaped to meet their needs. Charles C. Mann's 1491 says most tribes regularly scorched the forest understory into fertile char. They nurtured chosen trees for fruits, nuts, medicine, syrup, vines, building materials, weapons, firewood. With sophisticated skills perfected over the eons, they shaped the forest primeval into what appeared to those newcomers with eyes to see as an evolutionary parkland, burnt free of underbrush, fertilized with char, filled with productive trees, purposely balanced for a constant supply of wild game. In tandem came advanced techniques to breed, cross-pollinate, and rotate the crops that fed them. The tribes could claim certain technological advances, like the syringe, but their earthly genius was agriculture in field and forest, lake and stream. In places like the Ohio Valley, fertile topsoil, 9 feet deep, nurtured the holy, protein-rich trinity of corn, beans, and squash. The corn stalks usually anchored the beans and squash. Tomato and basil thrived in harmony. Nuts, roots, herbs, berries, fungi, and a cornucopia of fruits and vegetables beautifully fed a thriving civilization. Some villages were known to run 6 square miles and more of cornfields alone. Rather than domesticating animals, the indigenous managed waters, field, and forest to sustain a constant crop of fish and game. They treated disease with herbs, potions, poultices, teas. Above all, writes Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, quote, the majority of the indigenous peoples of the Americas had healthy, mostly vegetarian diets based on the staple of corn and supplemented by wild fish, fowl, and four-legged animals. People lived long and well, with abundant ceremonial and recreational periods. Trade flourished amongst the societies with a complex system of roads and paths, which became the roadways adopted by the early white settlers. In the Haudenosaunee Kainerugavova, or Sacred Law, says Onondaga faithkeeper Oren Lyons, quote, the first principle is peace. The second principle, equity, justice for the people. And third, the power of the good minds, of the collective powers to be of one mind, unity, and health, and the process of discussion, putting aside warfare as a method of reaching decisions, now using intellect, unquote. Through all indigenous societies ran the mystique of a natural paradise, a diverse, natural human ecology at one with Earth, largely free of spiritual angst and physical want. Among newcomers who could see it, indigenous America inspired a transcendent ideal that has powerfully resurfaced again and again throughout the spiral of our history. It is the vibrant, awakened aquifer of our creative core, the nature-based strand of our organic DNA. Quote, man is born free, wrote the romantic visionary Jean-Jacques Rousseau, quote, but everywhere lives in chains, unquote. The free were indigenous. Europe was imprisoned. At birth, U.S. revolutionaries used indigenous guerrilla tactics to beat the redcoats. The transcendent, Indian-loving genius Ben Franklin helped blend the Kainerugavova with a federal Congress and Bill of Rights. Quote, North Americans have maintained the European level with the strictest possible Puritanism, unquote, wrote the legendary Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. Quote, yet they could not prevent the souls of their Indian enemies from becoming their own, unquote. Our corporate elite still can't handle the tribal mystique. As individuals, the indigenous have been as flawed and full of contradiction as the rest of us, with clans and nations replete with imperfection. Over time, America's first peoples indulged in more than their share of war and conquest, injustice and outrage, just like the rest of us. But these advanced societies lived on this land for countless centuries. They created a sophisticated civilization as complex and advanced as anywhere, ever. Their eco-matriarchal ways stay rooted deep in our soil and our souls. Mainstream historians still deny, often with savage vehemence, the indigenous influence on America's current core beliefs. But how can people who have been on this land a mere half millennium or less so cavalierly dismiss the embedded impact of those who've been here 10, 20 millennium or more? In 1988, while Nancy Reagan ran the White House, a concurrent resolution of Congress confirmed the obvious. Quote, the original framers of the Constitution, including most notably George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, are known to have greatly admired the concepts, principles, and government practices of the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. The confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was explicitly modeled upon the Iroquois Confederacy, as were many of the democratic principles which were incorporated into the Constitution itself. Close quote. At Standing Rock and at Wounded Knee, at Winona LaDuke's Hemp and Heritage Farm, and at ongoing communal councils, with their resistance to eco-suicide, their respect for the earth, their belief in equity and democratic traditions, America's first peoples still hold vital keys to human survival. For so-called indigenous originalists who are committed to the health of the human circle, the Kainerugavova remains the ultimate American authority. At the core of our life and death spiral comes the repeated awakening of our indigenous DNA, a cyclical evolutionary embrace of natural diversity, reverence for life, consensual democracy, respect for women, love of justice, and eternal laughter. As a native attorney once told me, quote, "We like being called Indians. It reminds us that Columbus was lost," close quotes. As Oren Lyons, the legendary Haudenosaunee faithkeeper, puts it, freedom, that's what the whites found here. Next, our Puritan DNA, the cult of God the Father and his city on the hill. Countless immigrants have come here seeking that freedom. All have spliced their diverse customs and cultures into our DNA. But the uniquely uptight English Puritans would tolerate none of it. In the 1630s, 30,000 of these black-robed, doom-preaching, visible saints anointed Boston as their, quote, city on the hill. Their, quote, exceptional strain of corporate imperial Judeo-Christian white supremacy has repeatedly driven us to the brink of dictatorship, dragging us deep, deep down to Donald Trump. The Puritans brought passion for literacy, limited democracy, and advanced technology. They saw themselves as racially and spiritually superior, destined to dominate all nature and non-Puritans. Their dour, obsessive, paranoia, intolerance, arrogance, and greed still drive our global empire. Above all, said H.L. Mencken, the new Bostonians were driven mad by, quote, the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, might be happy, unquote. Hating both uppity women and diversity of opinion, Europe's Calvinists burned witches and dissidents in droves. Boston's Cotton Mather said he, quote, was once emptying the cistern of nature and making water at the wall. At the same time, there came a dog who did so too before me. Thought I, quote, what mean and vile things are the children of men in this mortal state? How much do our natural necessities abase us and place us in some regard on the same level with the very dogs, unquote. To the Puritans of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, the indigenous are heathen savages, agents of Satan, to be converted or killed, their culture crushed, their spirit exorcised, their wisdom denied. Their Mother Earth was, quote, a hideous wilderness, a purgatory of testing and torment, a hellish valley of the shadow of death, of briars and thorns, of trouble and sorrows, unquote. Throughout Europe, civilization was defined by sprawling, hideous cities, filthy, disease-ridden, unjust, violent. With an air of divine superiority, the newcomers meant to bring all that here. That included the custom of buying human scalps, as did Cromwell's Puritan armies in Ireland and other Euro conquerors elsewhere around the globe. America was now an exceptional mission, a manifest destiny. Boston was the New Jerusalem, God's own beacon. Its dictatorial theocracy was a corporate union of church and state. Elected by the proven faithful, Puritan magistrate priests ruled with a divinely ordained iron fist and an utter lack of humility or humor. They called themselves Christians, but the Puritan elite scorned the compassion of the Sermon on the Mount. The non-white, dissident, non-wealthy were, quote, unfit, except to labor in the fields, toil in the factories, die in battle. Had Jesus dared preach on a Boston street corner, he'd have been hanged on the spot. The Calvinist elect came to conquer, multiply, and impose the wrath of an angry God. Humans were born guilty, inherently doomed. Even the most apparently righteous suffered hell at his slightest whim. To escape this curse, every Puritan man had to read the Bible. Harvard was founded to teach them how. Women, of course, were scorned. But the Calvinist fathers worried they might have souls. So they let the women read, but not vote, and females who dared speak out, like Anne Hutchinson and her Quaker sisters, were expelled or hanged. A Puritan could eat, but not enjoy it. Drink alcohol, but only as a sacrament. Have sex, but only within marriage, and not for fun. Any variance from the missionary position was deemed criminal, even in wedlock. Self-appointed sex police peeked in windows to make sure. No warrant was required. Visible lust was a mortal sin. Being gay was beyond discussion. Hymnals were for church. Dancing was for the devil. So apparently was bathing. Many indigenous began their days with a dip in a nearby lake or stream. But Europeans immersed themselves rarely, kept to the same clothes, and stank to high heaven even before they got there. Sabbath entertainment was an endless biblical horror show. Black-robed priests raged on for hours. You came or else. Forget about leaving early, though George Washington later got away with it. Getting filthy rich meant you were probably, but not definitely, headed for heaven. That article of faith metastasized into an insatiable obsession for which no amount of money can ever be enough, no matter what the cost to people and the planet. The Calvinist ethic was the spirit of capitalism. The rage for riches was God's anointed way. Technology was beloved as his tool to conquer and consume a hellish earth and its damnable sinners. Soon the Bay Colony stripped nearly all the fish from Cape Cod Bay. It raped hillsides bare. It poisoned streams and extincted game, all in the desperate pursuit of divine favor. The Puritan corporate imperial elite was God's elect, duty-bound for ready cash and Christian empire. But they suffered a psychotic twist, predestination. No matter how obsessively even the purest Puritan worked and suffered, God's plan was immutable. Free will was meaningless. The truest believer could still be scorched to death. This, quote, horrible decree, unquote, infected our visible saints with terminal paranoia and totalitarian intolerance. Doubt itself was the ultimate Calvinist terror. A bad dream, a weak moment, an errant thought, a glimpse of lust, a breath of joy, these were Satan's calling cards. The Puritan psyche could bear neither personal uncertainty nor public dissent. Said Nathaniel Ward, quote, "He that is willing to tolerate any religion besides his own either doubts his own or is not sincere in it, unquote. The Puritan Trinity was God, gold, and glory. History's divine path led to empire or damnation. Calvinism, wrote Tawney, is, quote, like a coiled spring that shatters every obstacle by its rebound, unquote. In 6 stages from 1688 to 1992, that Puritan fury spun the placid cycles of indigenous harmony up an evolutionary axis, a techno-imperial spiral. Like the seasons of the year, alternating pulses of evolving consciousness moved from materialistic winter to thaw and crack where the light got in, to a springtime awakening, then to a hot summer of war, then an autumn reaction, and finally another winter's decay and freeze. These shortening seasons, whirling like a sea spout, have twirled our American organism towards an end of empire apocalypse. They've driven our species to unimaginable imperial wealth and technological mastery, metastasized with greed, intolerance, injustice, racism, sexual misogyny, ecological suicide, and a dark, depressing view of life itself. Yet all that is balanced with awakened indigenous outbursts for grassroots democracy, peace, social justice, ecological sanity, raucous humor, spiritual transcendence, not to mention sex, drugs, rock and roll. Human survival demands that we somehow fuse this back and forth, life and death feud between our sustainable Mother Earth and our imperious God the Father. A working synthesis is our ultimate imperative, our evolutionary key, our gateway to a future. So let's go find it. Next, the people's spiral of U.S. history, our 6 shortening cycles, 1688 to 1992. Quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Mark Twain. Next, Cycle 1, Infant Empire. Burst of energy, the glorious revolution. In an epic rape, European seed impregnated our indigenous mother. We took embryonic shape in 1688. At birth, 1776, we turned the world upside down. First came the Vikings. Their sleek, seminal schooners crossed oceans, sailed up our rivers, penetrated Greenland and Canada as they had Ireland and the continent. Then, maybe, came the Chinese. Gavin Mendez says 2 of their very big boats landed on our west coast in 1421. It's an intriguing assertion in search of hard evidence. But in 1492, Columbus brought greed, torture, and religious totalitarianism. Spain raped Florida for her youth and treasure, then pillaged the great Southwest long before the Pilgrims did it to Plymouth. Spanish horses transformed the prairie. Conquistadors gutted the great Aztec, Mayan, and Incan civilizations. They torched heathen libraries equal to any in Europe, a crippling loss of priceless human wisdom. They further assaulted the heathen blasphemy of America's nature-based spirituality with a pharmacratic institution that's yet to end. As Michael Pollan put it in How to Change Your Mind, quote, the Spanish sought to crush the mushroom cults, viewing them, rightly, as a mortal threat to the authority of the church. The Nahuatl word for mushrooms, flesh of the gods, must have sounded to Spanish ears like a direct challenge to the Christian sacrament, close quote. In Spain's Catholic footsteps, Boston's Puritan corporate elite followed with an all-out attack, yet to end, on the peyote used for centuries by North American tribes to penetrate the mysteries of the indigenous cosmos. Likewise, the authoritarian drug wars aimed to crush the unruly, unfathomable cannabis, LSD, psilocybin awakened 1960s counterculture, and much, much more. Despite the immense resources put into the drug wars and the immeasurable pain they've inflicted through the cycles of our history, these autocratic attempts to crush our nature-based beliefs have utterly failed. Instead, they have fed the cyclical cultural war that defines so much of our human dynamic. In 1588, Spain's Catholic Philip II tried to off his uppity Anglican sister-in-law, Elizabeth I. For his holy armada, Philip ate Iberia's forests and drank the blood of countless innocents he sacrificed in the mines, foundries, fields, and forests. In a single night, July 29th, 1588, God's own Protestant wind sank that ill-got wealth, plus 15,000 soldiers and sailors. Philip, thankfully, never recovered. Good Queen Bess's first American colony, Roanoke, disappeared around then. But starting in 1607 Virginia, much of our newcomer DNA was shaped by rich white cavaliers. Jamestown was a hellish swamp, poisoned by war, pestilence, and America's newborn racism. The Virginia Corporation poured in a steady stream of human filler. Half died yearly until the white population stabilized. The indigenous have yet to recover. By the law of primogeniture, the Cavaliers' estates in southern England went to the firstborn boys. So their younger brothers came here to cash in on history's deadliest drug, tobacco, the curse of the red man. The young lords afflicted southern land with the medieval brutality of their cushy childhoods. They spawned chattel slavery, American racism, the Three-Fifths bonus, the Confederacy, the KKK, Jim Crow, Southern strategy, drug war, Trump's MAGA, and the brutal autocracy that still curses us. In 1619, Africans deepened our DNA. The first score were cruelly traded for supplies at Port Comfort, Virginia. Millions more were soon stripped from ancient civilizations, as rich, wise, and diverse as any on earth. Yet the white masses fearfully denied Africa's humanity and ignored its wisdom. Chained to ship bottoms and whipping posts, these tragic innocents died by the millions. As the Spaniards burned the Mayan libraries and the English scorned the gifts of America's indigenous, New World slave masters shredded African genius into menial labor. They crippled our growth and impoverished our souls with cruel contempt for a universe of knowledge in agriculture, medicine, science, government, the arts. Most Africans dragged to earliest Virginia served out their indenture and gained their freedom. Some built their own plantations. Blacks and whites freely associated, worked side by side, intermarried, raised rainbow children. But in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon, a ruthless cavalier, led black and white workers in a violent uprising aimed at taking indigenous land. 1,000 multiracial rebels drove Royal Governor William Berkeley from Jamestown, then torched it. They slaughtered peaceful tribes and took their ancestral homes. Berkeley and Bacon soon died, so did the rebellion, but for Virginia's white planters, mixed-race insurrection became the ultimate nightmare. So they turned the colonial working class against itself. The tool was chattel slavery. The legacy was lethal racism. Economic historians still debate whether the, quote, peculiar institution, unquote, was financially superior to indentured servitude. But the slave owners cruelly crushed their chattel into an untouchable, subhuman caste. White masses beat, raped, tortured, and sold their slaves at will. They branded even the children, many biologically their own, legally, spiritually, and genetically inferior. The point was to make the poor whites, no matter how destitute, think themselves better than any black. As Lyndon Johnson put it 3 centuries later, quote, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you," unquote. This hideous strategy shattered the American soul. Chattel slavery's race bribe became a deadly obsession, the divide and conquer weapon of mass distraction used by corporate elites to rule American politics, right up to the 2016 race hate campaign that put Donald Trump in the White House. From Cavalier, Virginia to Trump Tower, from Bacon's Rebellion to the drug war, America's race card has been reliably deployed to divide the working middle class and poison the body politic. As a weapon of caste warfare, an excuse for conquest, a method of mass manipulation, the illusion of white supremacy has been America's ultimate birth defect, its core cancer. A year after the first Africans arrived in Virginia, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth with 102 whites. They were headed for contract labor in the Virginia Company's tobacco fields. Some were religious refugees. Others were impoverished, quote, strangers, unquote, desperate for a new life. But a pilgrim wind blew them to Cape Cod. Anchored offshore, 41 men drew up the Mayflower Compact. It was our first Declaration of Independence. It proclaimed their freedom from corporate overlords. No women were allowed to sign. On the beach, Squanto greeted the pilgrims in the Queen's English. He'd been shanghaied by traders 3 years earlier and was put on display in London. The newcomers moved into the homes of Squanto's relations, just dead from diseases brought by trappers and traders. Their first Thanksgiving, celebrated in 1621, was certified as a national holiday by Abe Lincoln just after Gettysburg. In the 1630s, some 30,000 Puritans came to make Boston the dystopian paradise of a hateful God. But the visible saints never quite achieved divine perfection. Like Satan himself and his awakened kin through all of our historic cycles, Boston's outliers were relentless rebels. Thomas Morton danced around a maypole with indigenous neighbors who were, quote, most full of humanity and more friendly than the Puritans, unquote. Samuel Maverick joyously mocked God's elect, who continually locked him up. When Roger Williams preached love and compassion, the Puritans left him in the woods to freeze. But local Narragansetts took the saintly priest to Providence, which in 1636 he made a haven for runaway slaves and endangered indigenous, as well as Quakers, Jews, and uppity women. That included Anne Hutchinson, our first pioneer white feminist. A highly literate rebel Puritan, her freewheeling salons infuriated the Boston elite. They expelled her for claiming direct communion with God and for knowing Scripture better than they did. For the next 100 years, Bay Colony Puritans ran a totalitarian tyranny, hanging witches, deporting dissidents, desperately seeking the pure totality that, thankfully, forever escapes them. Down the coast, Manhattan was a rich hunting ground, shared by regional tribes for countless centuries. In 1624, Dutch traders gifted the locals 60 guilders in junk jewelry. The tribes took it as a gesture of appreciation for letting them hunt there. But the Dutch thought they'd bought the place, which made zero sense to people who had no concept of private land. Divided and fenced, the game moved on. Soon a bustling hub of trade and commerce, the Duke of York, later James II, claimed New Amsterdam in 1664 without firing a shot. Unlike Boston, New York had no dress code or sex police. A freewheeling haven for sailors and merchants, printers and populists, dissidents and Democrats, it became, and still is, the ultimate port town. 3 centuries later, Mohawk skywalkers danced atop its tallest buildings. To the southwest, the Scotch-Irish poured into the Alleghenies. Many fled England's awful Puritan dictator, Oliver Cromwell, who conquered Scotland and Ireland, setting off a ghastly civil war that ended only when Bill Clinton charmed them down. These tough, resourceful, hillbilly Highlanders married into the Cherokee Nation, loved their freedom, hated the British. Their frontier farms formed the mountainous backbone of our yeoman culture and the fiery heart of the upcoming revolution. At the colony's core was the city of brotherly love. Its Quaker founders preached equality and justice, civility and peace. Their Society of Friends was born in defiance of Cromwell's Puritans, who jailed them without mercy. The Quakers' relentless godfather, George Fox, preached nonviolent resistance. His so-called inner light embraced all humans, black and white, male and female, rich and poor, prince and pauper. His American friends planted the early roots of democratic socialism, which flowed into our DNA through Thomas Paine, a Quaker's son, and Ben Franklin, our transcendent genius. Unique in all the world, Philadelphia was a haven for dissidents and dreamers, rebels and utopians. The Quakers were austere and prosperous, open and loving. They sat silent in their meeting houses until the Spirit moved them. They lived simply, worked hard, made honest money, honored the indigenous, and resisted slavery, racism, greed, misogyny, excess. They embedded in our DNA an indelible love for peace, social justice, and human dignity, drawn straight from the Sermon on the Mount. Their patient, pushy, pacifist activism still warms our American soul. Neighboring Quaker New Jersey gave women, at least until 1808, their first right to vote. Maryland bounced between the churches of Rome and England, but at last embraced religious tolerance. In Virginia, the Cavalier slaveocracy that spread after Bacon's rebellion fused the poisons of British feudalism into a race-based tyranny, one of history's most brutal totalitarian regimes. Its foul legacy of caste and hate still cuts to the core of what our nation must overcome. In Georgia, Sir James Oglethorpe hoped to establish a utopian colony for some 60,000 prisoners sent here by the British Crown. Instead, the evil weed of chattel slavery took root, as it did in the Carolinas and wherever else cotton, and tobacco were grown. As a whole, our embryonic nation became an astounding mosaic. Into indigenous America's countless clans and confederacies, tribes and nations poured a turbulent tsunami of transcendent diversity, first from Europe and Africa, then from the whole globe. From moderate Plymouth and the rock-ribbed New England hill country to totalitarian Boston, benign Providence, raucous New York, the Scotch-Irish hill country, peace-loving Quaker Philadelphia, moderate New Jersey, diverse Maryland, and the slave-owning South, British America in the 1600s was a human hodgepodge unlike any other. Nor was it unified. Near century's end, 5 pesky Quakers invaded Boston, hippie style, to protest its Puritan pathology. Marching through town stark naked on the Sabbath, they lit up a mass nervous breakdown and were quickly hanged. News of their death was not well received, but the colonies had little to do with each other, beyond trade and gossip. Overall, the new Americans saw themselves as British citizens, living in distinct communities under imperial protection. For Cromwell and the kings, America's only purpose was to enrich England, whose colonial governors were mostly vile, violent, corrupt, and stupid. In 1688, James II repeated Philip II's fatal error of exactly a century before. He tried to make England Catholic again. Elizabeth's Anglican progeny said no. Scottish rebels swarmed down from the Highlands for James's daughter Mary and her liberal spouse, William of Orange. These, quote, hillbillies helped win a nonviolent, glorious revolution that came with a Bill of Rights, a Toleration Act, and empowered Parliament. Here in the colonies, we dumped James's lackeys. Boston locked up Edmund Andros, its insufferable royal governor. But disguised in a dress, Andros escaped. He thus birthed an epic chorus line of official cross-dressers, including Confederate President Jefferson Davis, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. From Maine to Georgia, the uprising's frontier fire engulfed our indigenous Puritans, Pilgrims, Quakers, Anglicans, Catholics, Jews, Deists, Unitarians, English, Dutch, Scots, Irish, Africans, Cavaliers, Hispanics, Asians, prisoners, agnostics, atheists, hillbillies, urban merchants, yeoman farmers, city workers, swashbuckling sailors, poor whites, drifters, grifters, dissidents, and other unruly human upstarts who surged into the glorious gumbo soon to become the United States of America. In 1689, good King Billy ordered Puritan Boston to stop hanging Quakers, even those who questioned authority. Our electric, eclectic embryo danced at the edge of indigenous freedom. Our awakened DNA was primed to twirl in an unsuspecting world upside down. Next, springtime, the first Great Awakening. Something drove Salem mad. Maybe in 1692-3, it was ergot, a brain-bending fungus. Ergot grows on damp, badly stored grain. Some say it shattered the Puritan mystique. Maybe it woke the new American mind to democracy and freedom, as cannabis, psilocybin, and LSD would double down 3 centuries later. The Glorious Revolution did destabilize colonial authority, and then there was the usual greed. When Salem's hysterical adolescents began pointing fingers, the quote witches were often women of means. The sheriff gladly grabbed their property, and somehow the accusatory girls' families wound up with much of the victims' lands. A score of them were hanged. Cheering crowds embraced the ritual slaughter like an early Super Bowl. They crushed to death a defiant Giles Corey, whose last demand was for, quote, more weight. Much of America was horrified. Colony-wide outrage undercut the Puritan death grip. Our later demands for separation of church and state, the right to a lawyer, protection from self-incrimination, credibility of evidence, all flowed through Salem's madness into history's greatest document, our truest birth certificate, our magnificent Bill of Rights. In the 1730s and 40s, a new spirituality exploded across the land. Jonathan Edwards lit the fuse. He didn't mean to. Edwards was a youthful spellbinder in the western Mass river town of Northampton. He mixed Calvinist hellfire and damnation with a frontier love of nature. The contradictions were impossible. They shattered his parish and shook our first cycle of spiritual transcendence to its indigenous roots. Young Jonathan began by terrorizing his flock. Each of them, he warned, was, quote, a sinner in the hands of an angry God. Quote, the God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times so abominable in his eyes as the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. You have offended him infinitely more than ever a stubborn rebel did his prince. And yet 'tis nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment. End quote. Aflame with such rants, terrified congregants begged for salvation. Edwards tortured them for hours, dragged them through hell, demanded obedience while they writhed in agony. But Jonathan was young and passionate. In a heartbeat, he could whiplash his sheep from their hellish purgatory to ecstatic transcendence. They once were lost, but now were found, quote, and now you have an extraordinary opportunity, a day wherein Christ has flung the door of mercy wide open and stands in the door, calling and crying with a loud voice to poor sinners, a day wherein many are flocking to him and pressing into the kingdom of God. Many that were very lately in the same miserable condition that you are in now a happy state, with their hearts filled with love for him that has loved them and washed them for their sins in his own blood. From there, Edward somehow leapt into the glorious bosom of a loving Mother Earth, born to a Puritan cult that saw nature as Satan's playground. Edward soared to a new birth, like a stoned, tree-hugging hippie, tripping his brains out on indigenous rapture. Quote, I walked abroad alone, in a solitary place, in my father's pasture, for contemplation. And as I was walking there, and looking up on the sky and the clouds, there came into my mind so sweet a sense of the glorious majesty and grace of God that I know not how to express. I seemed to see them both in a sweet conjunction, majesty and meekness, joined together. It was a sweet and gentle and holy majesty, God's excellency, his wisdom, his purity and love seemed to appear in everything, in the sun, moon, and stars, in the clouds and blue sky, in the grass, flowers, trees, in the water and all nature, end quote. With his right brain in hell and his left in paradise, like some psychedelic prophet on scriptural mushrooms, Jonathan Edwards drove his congregation to white America's second stoned-out wave of transcendent madness, this one on the bright side. Via ergot or otherwise, Northampton in 1735-36 flipped into a primeval group hug, a 9-month summer of love. Feuds were forgotten, debts forgiven, insults settled, laughter embraced, sex indulged. Tales of raucous music, group euphoria, and carnal daring filled the air. The pews filled with the, quote, conversion of many souls. Then they emptied. Souls on fire flocked to outdoor revivals to find God, nature, and raptured joy with maverick holy rollers a world apart from the old-line Calvinists. The Puritan elect quaked in horror at these frontier Woodstocks. Blacks and women freely preached. African drums turned hymnals into spiritual and gospel music that later evolved into jazz, swing, bebop, R&B, rock, rap, hip-hop. Ben Franklin's pal, George Whitefield, a cross-eyed English spellbinder, boomed with a voice that could be heard by 10,000 seekers long before the age of electric amplifiers. Evangelizing Methodists and Baptists, Presbyterians and pagans conjured up a cycle of transcendent energy that would fiercely pulsate again and again throughout the spiral of our history. The Great Awakening's grassroots spirituality pulverized the Puritans' rump rigidity. It blew open the arteries of social democracy. Its joyous transcendence smashed the stale death grip of Puritan exceptionalism. Again and again this would happen, with ascending power, up the axis of our history, forming a spiral. Freedom of the press was at the apex. As the Great Awakening shredded Northampton, New York's awful royal governor, William Cosby, jailed John Peter Zenger, a German immigrant, for printing defamatory pamphlets he didn't actually write. But Zenger's wife, Anna, kept the papers coming. An aroused mob surrounded the courthouse. On August 5th, 1735, after just 10 minutes of deliberation, a grassroots jury set Zenger free. The truth, they said, was protected speech. Freedom of the press was enshrined in our national DNA. So was the power of a great woman to lead a social movement. In the ensuing cycles of our history, each awakened springtime would shatter a winter of Puritan paralysis. New England's transcendentalists, 1830s to 50s, farm labor, populist, socialist, bohemian revolutionaries, 1870s to 1910s, grassroots radicals and New Deal social democrats, 1930s, New Left civil rights, black power, feminist, LGBTQ, anti-war, yippie, eco-countercultural activists, 1960s, Solartopian ecologists, 1970s and beyond, have all built on the best of the upheavals before. Grassroots democracy, social justice, racial equality, feminist ascendance, sexual freedom, psychedelic mind-bending, spiritual voyages, digital utopianism, artistic liberation, new art, thought, writing, speech, song, dance, sex. These form the lifeblood of our indigenous spirituality, our relentless, pulsating demand for egalitarian liberation and spiritual transcendence, the next stage of our human evolution. Sparked by the Calvinist rantings of an accidental instigator, sustained by a feminist media maven, the first Great Awakening aimed us like a flaming arrow at our imperial overlords. Next, summer, revolution. In 1776, it became our exceptional fate to show all humankind that the universal curse of empire, including our own, must eventually decompose. At birth, we were a perfect storm. Indigenous freedom and Puritan ferocity were both embedded in our embryo. We were literate, armed, organized, obstinate, and endowed with a visceral vision of inalienable rights. Our grassroots muscle came from a fierce farm community rooted in the gorgeous soil of an unspoiled continent being ripped from her most faithful lovers, and from a squabbly urban working class tired of being trashed by an imperial elite. We came with four visible saints who embodied much of our genius and many of our contradictions: Ben Franklin, Tom Paine, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson. Their brilliant inner orbit was lit by the likes of Abigail, John, and Samuel Adams, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Patrick Henry, Ethan Allen, and many more. They rode a grassroots wave of angry artisans and agrarians willing to fight and die for land, freedom, democracy, independence, revolution. Indigenous harmony, abolition of slavery, women's rights, universal suffrage, social democracy, economic justice, cultural tolerance, ecological sanity. All these would take more time. But in 1776, we did make an epic leap away from monarchy and titled aristocracy toward the promise of freedom embodied amongst the indigenous. In the early days of our birthing process, the Mahatma of the moment was Ben Franklin, master of the middle path, utterly unique in all of human history. Ben was born in Boston, 1706. The great sorcerer and his peerless apprentice, Thomas Paine, were our transcendent, secular humanists. In an age of reason, they taught that an enlightened mind and a compassionate soul could turn the world upside down. Ben was the 16th of his Puritan father's 17 children. He had virtually no formal education. How he became our greatest civic and scientific genius remains an intriguing enigma. As an ambitious teenager, Ben sought out Cotton Mather, Boston's leading Puritan, who told him to stoop with humility. The endlessly curious Franklin discovered, codified, quantified, organized, and made useful our initial understanding of electricity. The term battery is his. So is the lightning rod, which he refused to patent. He had all the money he needed, he said, and gifted this breakthrough device free to all. Ben also invented bifocals, swim fins, windsurfing, a flexible urinary catheter, thank God, an odometer. He created the glass harmonica, for which both Mozart and Beethoven composed original music. He did not patent his eco-green Franklin stove, which moved centuries of wasteful flames from open fireplaces into efficient metal boxes, conserving countless forests while saving homes and lungs from cancerous ash. Like today's photovoltaic cells and LED lighting, see our Solartopian finale, Ben's hot casks fused fiery natural harmony into modern technology. Sailing home from London in 1774, Ben became the first to chart the Atlantic Gulf Stream. His oceanographic readings still benchmark our climate crisis. In 1777, Congress sent our number one celebrity off to seduce France. His coonskin cap became an instant fashion statement, so he ordered a shipload and made yet another small fortune. Ben's funky visage graced dinnerware all over the continent. Franklin also pioneered the lending library, fire department, and public sanitation service, which cleaned Philadelphia's toxic streets. The mail service he ran, a precursor to the internet, linked up the new nation. The new arts of political cartooning and media syndication helped make him rich. At 42, Ben devoted himself to public service, maintaining, unlike Jefferson, a lifetime of reasonable solvency. Franklin revered indigenous wisdom. When he convened a conference in Albany to plot a union of the colonies in 1754, he chose a Haudenosaunee chief to preside over the proceedings. He embedded the Kainarikavova template into our federal constitution. Above all, as the true father of our country, Franklin endowed our DNA with a love of reason, moderation, humor, humility, and women. Like most U.S. founders, Ben was not a Christian. His deism embraced a divine creator who fired up the universe, gave humankind the power of reason, then left. No angry God judged our lives. No eternal hell threatened our sanity. Neither Jesus nor the Eucharist appeared in our federal constitution. No founder would call this a Christian nation. Like most whites at the time, the young Franklin first believed the blacks were inferior. He owned 2 slaves. But at a multiracial, probably Quaker school, he saw the black kids learning just as well as the whites. He freed his own slaves and demanded abolition. His last essay, in 1790, mocked our nation's covenant with hell. Ben's adopted son, Thomas Paine, was the 18th century's best-selling author. Born to a British Quaker, Tom's riveting common sense demanded independence, social justice, and an end to monarchy. It was read, sung, heard, and praised by virtually all Americans. It lit our revolutionary fuse. No other agitator's screed has ever had a bigger impact. Paine and Franklin were early social democrats. They hated chattel slavery and the kind that comes when a greedy elite hoards more property than it really needs. Paine mocked the death penalty and war as immoral tools of a callous ruling class. He demanded the vote for all, regardless of race, gender, or class. He pushed free public education, a guaranteed minimum income, support for our elders, like the Social Security system won by a later Franklin. Such radicalism was rooted in a screaming band of awakened Americans demanding freedom, justice, land. They hated the king's obscene wealth, his smug imperial overlords, and the corrupt East India Tea Company. George, too, was a madman who ran naked through the streets of London, breaking windows. George III barely spoke at all until age 11. In 1763, the Brits beat the French in America and India. The sun didn't set on their global empire for nearly 2 centuries. But the king didn't want his imperial troops back in London, and he was too cheap to build barracks for them here. So he demanded we feed and house his troops while they took our jobs and hit on our daughters. We kicked in the womb. In Boston, 1770, we broke water. We flung ice balls at the remnant redcoats. In March, they shot 5 of us dead. Crispus Attucks, a black man, died first. In 1773, our supreme agitator used that massacre to rouse the rabble for an anti-corporate assault. Dressed as Mohawks, Sam Adams and his Sons of Liberty pitched the East India Company's tea into Boston Harbor. Quote, "Rally Mohawks and bring your axes and tell King George we'll pay no taxes," unquote. Nobody was harmed at the Tea Party. They did bust a captain's lock, which they replaced, Quaker style, the next day. Then the Brits made Franklin into a revolutionary. Ben was in London on business. He supported the king and had nothing to do with the Tea Party. But in January 1774, some pompous lords, the scum of England's idle rich, summoned Ben into a public hearing for a torrent of abuse. Franklin stood perfectly silent. Then he sailed home, charting the Gulf Stream along the way, and hurled his exceptional genius into an earth-shattering overthrow. In April 1775, the Redcoats marched to Concord, meaning to hang Sam Adams and John Hancock, our richest smuggler. Instead, they killed 8 farmers. It was the imperial thing to do. But they still had to get back to Boston, about 30 miles. From dozens of nearby farms, we swarmed through the forests, Indian style. We shot from behind rocks and trees and slipped away, then did it again, and yet again. Some 250 redcoats fell. It was the first white anti-imperial bloodbath. Our guerrilla tactics fed a mighty stream of global rebellion that led straight to Vietnam, whose stealth fighters decimated our own imperial army 2 centuries later. Soon after Concord, George Washington took charge. He was a lousy open-field tactician. During the French-Indian War, the indigenous shot him repeatedly, but somehow he lived and used their tactics to beat the British. Among the Iroquois himself, like his great-grandfather before him, George Washington was called Tenoticarius, destroyer of towns. Quote, "When that name is heard," unquote, wrote the Seneca, quote, "our women look behind them and turn pale, and our children cling close to the neck of their mothers," unquote. In 1779, an expedition under his command, led by John Sullivan, destroyed 40 Iroquois villages, burning homes and crops so the natives would starve in winter. Sullivan's troops used the flesh of the dead for leggings. Washington later warned that breaking treaties with the tribes would destroy our nation's, quote, honor. The U.S. subsequently broke more than 400 of those treaties. Martha made George our richest slave owner. The father of our country was probably sterile from a childhood fever. He had lousy teeth and no biological children, but he did have great hair and never wore a wig. Our biggest brewer, George named his dogs Tipsy and Drunkard. Master of the barnyard curse, he was infamous for walking out of Sunday services early. His Bible came with a flask. The man who, quote, could not tell a lie, unquote, loved espionage. His daring network of citizen spies dizzied the Brits with strategic feints and fake intelligence. On Christmas Eve, 1776, his astounding sneak attack on Trenton saved the Revolution. To train our ragtag army, Washington recruited his Prussian friend, Baron von Steuben, who was openly gay. At Valley Forge, George's aide-de-camp, Alexander Hamilton, lived in open bliss with his lover, John Lorenz. George later wrote a community of Rhode Island Jews, confirming their place in the new republic. when his troops were in despair, our richest slave owner asked our most radical scribe, Tom Paine, to evoke, quote, the times that try men's souls, and to rally, quote, our winter soldiers. About a fifth of those soldiers may have been African American. Britain's Lord Dunsmore had offered slaves their freedom in exchange for military service. Like Lincoln in the Civil War, Washington quickly realized he could not win without black soldiers. They stayed in uniform longer than whites and may have contributed a quarter of the Revolutionary Army's overall service time. An all-black regiment arose from Rhode Island. Amidst the chaos, as many as 50,000 slaves went free. 20 of Washington's ran away, including Hercules, his very large personal bodyguard. In 1799, pending Martha's death, George freed his remaining human property. As a drinking buddy, George was pretty cold. He hated to be touched, even on the shoulder. He later split with Tom Paine. But our independence was won by common folk using indigenous tactics, led by an infamous Indian killer who later decried their slaughter and warned against breaking their treaties. George's last will called for his slaves' freedom as he confirmed a basic faith in the grassroots citizenry. Quote, the great mass of our citizens require only to understand matters rightly, to form right decisions.